The autumn air hung heavy with rain that night, soaking through the hedges and dripping down the narrow lanes of Chipping Cleghorn. The village slept, save for the house at the end of Willowbrook Lane, a sprawling Georgian residence known locally as the Larches. Inside its grand walls, laughter and conversation had echoed only hours before. A small gathering of friends and neighbours had come for supper. Now the house lay silent, the guests gone, except for the police constables who were bustling through the hall and up the grand staircase toward the blue-painted guest chamber, the Blue Room. Its door stood wide open, though it had been locked from the inside only minutes before the commotion began. Sergeant Hadley scratched his head, staring at the lifeless figure sprawled on the polished oak floor. Arthur Penrose, the host's brother-in-law, a man known for his sharp tongue and peculiar habits, lay stiff with a strange look of surprise. On his face, there was no sign of forced entry. The single window, though slightly ajar, was 3 stories above the garden and impossible to reach without a ladder. The only key to the door had been found inside, beneath the body itself. And then there was the clue, or what might have been a clue. A porcelain teacup, painted with faded blue roses, stood upright on the bedside table, half filled with cold tea. No one in the house recalled bringing it. No one had seen Penrose take a cup upstairs. And when the doctor arrived, he declared the man had not been poisoned by tea at all, but had died suddenly of a blow to the head from an object nowhere to be found. The scene was tidy, almost staged. The bed remained made, the curtains untouched, no scuffle or struggle apparent. It looked as though Penrose had simply fallen down dead, except for the sharp wound at the back of his skull. Inspector Craythorne, broad-shouldered and red-cheeked, stood with his arms folded, glaring at the corpse as though intimidation might force a confession from it. "Locked door, no weapon, no intruder," he muttered. "And what in blazes is a teacup doing here?" No, one had an answer. It was then, as dawn began to pale against the rain-smeared windows, that Miss Marple appeared at the threshold, small and quiet, her umbrella folded neatly in her gloved hand. She had not been present at the supper that evening, but the noise of police activity had spread swiftly through the village, and her curiosity, as ever, had brought her to the scene. "Terrible business," she said softly, her voice quivering, like the delicate china ornaments that lined the room. "Arthur Penrose, you say? And in the Blue Room? I always thought him a most disagreeable man. Still, murder is a dreadful thing." The inspector frowned but did not dismiss her. He had learned, through many an uncomfortable case, that Miss Marple's pale blue eyes saw more than most. "If you've any thoughts, madam, you're welcome to them. The sooner we make sense of this, the better." She stepped carefully inside, her gaze passing over the body. The key, the cup, and then up toward the ceiling cornices, as though searching for a misplaced thread. "A locked door often suggests more than it conceals," she murmured. "It tells us someone wanted to make this appear impossible, and when something seems impossible, it is usually very simple indeed." She looked at the teacup for a long time. "Strange, isn't it? How objects find their way into rooms where they don't belong. A teacup here, of all places, though no tray, no saucer, no sign of crumbs, almost as though it were placed to be noticed." The inspector scowled. "Placed? By whom, Miss Marple?" "The man lived alone in this room, came up here after dinner, locked the door, and was struck down by thin air, apparently. None of the guests could have entered without breaking the lock. We've tested it ourselves." Miss Marple bent to look at the body, her old joints creaking but her eyes sharp. "Struck from behind, you say? Yet the wound is clean. He would not have turned his back to a stranger, I think, and the window opened just a fraction. Did anyone hear it creak or feel a draught?" The sergeant shook his head. "No sound at all, ma'am." "Curious," she said, almost to herself. "And this key beneath him, such a tidy place to leave it, as though someone had known it must be found, but not too easily. But people do make little mistakes when they arrange their scenes." The inspector grunted. "All very well, but unless you've discovered an invisible murderer hiding in the wallpaper, I'm none the wiser." Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she turned to the window, her thin fingers brushing the sill. A faint smudge of earth clung to the wood, a trace so slight it might have gone unnoticed. She did not remark on it aloud, but her mind stored it carefully, like a note in the margin of a book. The guests who had been present the night before were being questioned downstairs. Mrs. Penrose, pale with shock, insisted her brother-in-law had been in good spirits. Colonel Ashworth swore he had last seen him with a glass of brandy, not tea. Young Lydia Markham, a distant cousin, grew flustered under questioning, claiming she had gone to bed early and heard nothing at all. Each account seemed ordinary, yet something in the timing, in the subtle glances exchanged, suggested otherwise. As Miss Marple descended the stairs, she thought again of the teacup, of the open window, of the strangely neat position of the key. The blue room, with its locked door and impossible crime, was no sealed puzzle after all. It was a message, deliberately constructed. The question was not how Arthur Penrose had been killed, nor even who had done it, but rather, why would someone go to such lengths to make it appear impossible? And as she settled into a chair by the her knitting bag in her lap, she knew the answer would not be found in grand theories of invisible assassins or poisoned tea. It would be found, as always, in the small things, an overlooked detail, a quiet habit, a slip of behavior that betrayed the hand behind the act. The blue room still held its secrets, but Miss Marple had already begun to untangle them. And somewhere among the gathered guests, the murderer sat waiting, perhaps even listening, believing their crime beyond discovery. But Jane Marple knew better. Miss Marple's presence in the drawing-room of the Larches was as inconspicuous as a vase of flowers, and yet her eyes saw everything. She sat in a modest armchair with her knitting bag resting against her knees, her needles clicking softly, though her gaze strayed far more often to the company gathered around than to the half-formed sock between her hands. The police went about their work with methodical earnestness. Inspector Craythorne questioning one guest after another, Sergeant Hadley making notes with clumsy speed. But it was the subtle moments between words, the delicate shifts of expression, that Miss Marple found most illuminating. Arthur Penrose's body had been carried away, the blue room sealed until further examination. But the ripples of his death were only beginning to spread through the house. His sister, Mrs. Eleanor Penrose, had collapsed into a chaise longue, clutching a damp handkerchief, her voice trembling as she assured the inspector that her brother had no enemies, no debts, nothing that could possibly explain such a dreadful fate. And yet Miss Marple noticed how Eleanor's eyes darted, just for a moment, toward the half-open drinks cabinet across the room, before quickly returning to her rehearsed grief. Colonel Ashworth, stout and blustering, gave his statement with indignant force. He had known Arthur for years, he said, and though the man had a beastly temper and could insult an army of saints, there was no cause here for murder. He pounded the arm of his chair as he spoke, his moustache bristling, but Miss Marple's attention lingered instead on his boots. They were polished, but the edge of one sole bore a faint crust of damp soil, the kind not found on the gravel path to the house, but more like the rich loam of the garden. Then there was Lydia Markham, young and pale, her hands twisting at the lace trim of her dress. She had been staying at the Larches only a week, a distant cousin come down from London. Her story was simple. She had gone to her room early, heard nothing of the commotion until it was too late. But her voice faltered when asked whether she had seen Arthur that evening, and her eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the teacup the constables had brought down from the blue room. Inspector Craythorne dismissed the object with a grunt. A red herring if ever I saw one. A house like this, cups get left about. Our concern is the locked door. Impossible for anyone to have entered without breaking it down. Miss Marple's needles paused in mid-air. Oh, I shouldn't say impossible, Inspector. People are often quite ingenious when they believe themselves to be cleverer than everyone else. The trouble is, cleverness has a way of leaving little traces behind. One need only look closely. The inspector sighed. If you mean smudges on window-sills and the like, our men will see to it, but I dare say we won't find anything so convenient. Convenient, Miss Marple repeated gently. Oh no, truth is rarely convenient. That is why so many prefer lies. She glanced toward Lydia, whose cheeks flushed at once, though she quickly looked down at her hands again. A tray of refreshments arrived then, carried in by the maid, a girl of perhaps 16 with nervous eyes. She placed the tray on the table, nearly spilling the sherry as her hand shook. Miss Marple's gaze followed her retreat, noting the way the maid avoided looking at Eleanor Penrose altogether. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. But fear of what? When the questioning resumed, Miss Marple shifted in her chair, her fingers now resting lightly on the yarn. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully, almost as though speaking to herself, "why Mr. Penrose locked his door so promptly after retiring. A curious habit, don't you think? Locks are rather symbolic things. They keep danger out or perhaps keep secrets in." Colonel Ashworth gave a grunt. "He always locked it. Paranoid fellow. Said he couldn't abide the thought of someone poking through his things. Dashed rude about it too." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "So it was not unusual. That does make it more difficult to know whether the lock was meant to conceal his own fears or someone else's intentions. Still, it is always interesting when a man of routine suddenly departs from it. Did anyone notice such a change in his behavior?" There was silence, then Lydia spoke, her voice trembling. He seemed quieter than usual at dinner, less argumentative. He hardly touched his pudding, though he always loved sweet things. I thought it strange at the time, but I said nothing. Inspector Craythorne scribbled in his notebook, but Miss Marple looked more closely at Lydia's face. Not at the words themselves, but at the way her lips pressed tight after she spoke, as though sealing in more than she had allowed to escape. It was then that Miss Marple asked the question no one else had considered. "Was Mr. Penrose in the habit of drinking tea before bed?" Eleanor Penrose blinked at her. "Tea? Goodness no, he always preferred brandy in the evenings. Said tea made him restless." "Then how very curious," Miss Marple replied softly, "that he should have had a cup of it by his bed." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Lydia dropped her lace trim at once, her fingers tightening until the knuckles showed white. Colonel Ashworth shifted uncomfortably, and Eleanor, though still dabbing at her eyes, let her gaze slip again unwillingly toward the drinks cabinet. The inspector scoffed. "It proves nothing, Miss Marple. Perhaps the maid carried it up absent-mindedly." "Perhaps," she said, with a faint smile. "But absent-mindedness is rather a rare thing in servants who know they will be scolded for the smallest mistake. No, I think that cup was meant to be seen. Just as the lock was meant to be admired, and the window meant to puzzle us. Someone here is constructing a picture. The question is, what part of the picture do they most hope we overlook?" The inspector huffed again, but Miss Marple resumed her knitting with calm assurance. In her mind, the pieces were beginning to stir, not yet forming a whole, but aligning into patterns. The teacup, the soil on the colonel's boot, the maid's trembling, Lydia's faltering story, all were small things, yet small things were where the truth hid. Deception had already shown itself, though the murderer likely believed their work flawless. Miss Marple, however, knew that in human affairs there was no such thing as flawless. There was always a thread loose, a button askew, a gesture made 1 second too soon. And as she sat among the grieving household, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction crossed her mind. The Blue Room murder was not unsolvable. It was merely waiting for the right eye to see it. Inspector Craythorne gathered the household once more in the drawing-room, his heavy boots pacing across the carpet as he prepared to question each of them in turn. Rain still tapped steadily against the tall windows, the sound giving the room an odd, muffled quality, as though the world outside had been sealed off, leaving only this small company bound together by suspicion. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively, in her chair, knitting in her lap, her eyes darting from face to face with quiet attentiveness. The inspector began with Eleanor Penrose. "Madam," he said firmly, "you were your brother's hostess this evening. Tell us once more how the evening proceeded from the moment dinner began." Eleanor straightened her posture as though summoning her dignity, though her voice trembled faintly. "Arthur was late to table, as he so often was. He took only a little soup and declined the fish. He drank a glass of brandy, then rose earlier than the rest of us, saying he wished to retire. That was the last I saw of him." "Did he seem in good health?" Craythorne asked. "He complained of a slight headache, but nothing unusual. Arthur was often unwell. His temper gave him indigestion, I always thought." She gave a brittle smile, the kind that hoped to pass for composure. Miss Marple noticed how Eleanor twisted her handkerchief as she spoke, and how her gaze flickered once more to the drinks cabinet. Not once had she looked toward the teacup, sitting plain upon the side table, as though waiting for someone to claim it. Next, Colonel Ashworth cleared his throat. Blasted tragedy, this. The man was intolerable at times, yes, but one doesn't expect a fellow guest to wind up murdered. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice booming. "I'll say this again, Inspector. I was in the billiard room after dinner, practicing a few strokes alone. Anyone can tell you the sound carried. I couldn't possibly have left without someone." "Noticing?" "Indeed," said Craythorne, though he scribbled with less enthusiasm. "And you saw Mr. Penrose retire?" "I did." He muttered something about being tired, strode up the stairs and slammed his door as was his way. "I thought nothing of it." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the Colonel's boots once more. The faint smudge of garden soil still crusted at the edge of one sole. If he had spent the evening in the billiard room, why the telltale trace of damp earth? Lydia Markham was next. She looked smaller than ever in her chair, her pale fingers plucking at the lace trim of her sleeve. I wasn't feeling quite myself after dinner," she whispered. "The country air is heavy. I went up early before the others. Truly, I heard nothing until the dreadful commotion began." Craythorne frowned. "And you can swear you did not see Mr. Penrose after he left the table?" Her lips parted, then pressed closed again. No, I did not." The words came, haltingly, as though pushed out under strain. Her eyes slid toward the teacup again, then quickly away. Miss Marple caught the fleeting glance. It was not curiosity, but recognition, the kind one tries to bury quickly. The inspector called for the maid, little Clara, who stepped into the room with her apron neatly pressed, though her hands betrayed her nervousness. "For you carried up a tray of tea things, did you not?" Craythorne asked. "Yes, sir, but only for the drawing-room. I never took anything upstairs." "Did Mr. Penrose ask you for a cup?" "Oh, no, sir. He never liked tea. Said it made his head ache." Miss Marple gave the girl a kindly smile. "You are quite sure, dear? You never saw him carry a cup away, perhaps absent-mindedly?" Clara shook her head so quickly her cap ribbons quivered. "No, ma'am. If I'd left one upstairs, Mrs. Penrose would have scolded me terribly." She blurted this too fast, her eyes darting toward her mistress, then quickly lowering to the floor. Inspector Craythorne dismissed her, but Miss Marple continued watching the girl as she slipped from the room. The fear in her face was not the fear of being accused of murder. It was the fear of saying the wrong thing in front of Eleanor. That, too, was a kind of clue. When the questioning ended, contradictions lay scattered like breadcrumbs. "Eleanor," insisted Arthur, had only brandy that night. The Colonel swore he had retreated upstairs with a slam of the door. Lydia denied seeing him at all, though her eyes betrayed a secret connection to the teacup. And the maid was adamant she had never brought tea to the blue room. Each account was plausible on its own, yet they refused to fit neatly together. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "It is curious," she remarked gently, "how stories, when repeated, begin to show little cracks. One person insists a man was drinking brandy, another remembers him tired and retiring, and yet a third insists he was never seen again after dinner. And all of them are true, of course, true in the way that memories are true, but sometimes the most telling part of a story is not what is said, but what is left out." The inspector groaned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Miss Marple said with a faint smile, "that Mr. Penrose did not go to his room quite as directly as we suppose, and someone here knows very well where he went." Her words fell into the silence, and she did not look at Eleanor, nor at Lydia, nor even at the Colonel. She looked at the teacup, small, ordinary, and yet so deliberately placed. For in her experience, nothing in human behavior was more revealing than the things people tried hardest to disguise. The deception was there already, in every hesitant word and every eager protestation of innocence. Miss Marple knew that one of them had woven their story too carefully, too neatly, forgetting that lies rarely hold when examined from more than one angle. And as she resumed her knitting, her mind turned over the contradictions with patient precision, knowing the next question she asked would tighten the net around the guilty party, even if they did not yet realize it. The blue room still seemed locked from the inside, but the minds of those gathered were already beginning to unlock, their falsehoods revealing more truth than they intended. And Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and quiet eyes, was listening to every word. The household of the Larches settled uneasily into the grey morning, though no one truly rested. A damp mist clung to the windows, muffling the garden beyond, as if the world outside hesitated to intrude upon the tangle of lies and secrets within. Inspector Craythorne sat at the writing desk, with his notes spread before him, his brow furrowed. Each account he had taken the night before overlapped in odd ways, like mismatched puzzle pieces that refused to fit. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her armchair, continued with her knitting, but her pale eyes flicked often from the inspector's growing frustration to the restless movements of the suspects. Colonel Ashworth stamped about the drawing-room, muttering about wasted time. Eleanor Penrose, pale and drawn, dabbed her eyes with a crumpled handkerchief, sighing loudly at intervals. Lydia Markham kept to her chair, her gaze cast downward, though her fingers betrayed her agitation, twisting again and again at the lace of her sleeve. The air was heavy with suspicion, unspoken yet keenly felt by all. Craythorne thumped his notebook shut. "We've 3 suspects, each with motive, though none with opportunity, at least not that we can prove. Penrose was found locked in his chamber, the weapon vanished, the only key beneath his body. I've seen puzzles before, but never one. Why so confounded?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside with a soft clack of needles. "Perhaps, Inspector, it would help to consider the matter from another angle. Opportunity is often easier to disguise than motive. Yet motives have a way of shining through, however one tries to hide them." The inspector gave a grunt of agreement. "Very well, let us list them plainly." "Eleanor first," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. As his sister and hostess, she stood closest to him. Her dependence upon Arthur's money has long been whispered in the village. Should he have chosen to alter his will or withdraw his generosity, her comfortable life here might have come to an abrupt end. Eleanor's face flushed. "That is a vile insinuation. My brother was most generous, yes, but I never asked for it. He was family." "Family ties," Miss Marple said gently, "can bind in many ways, Mrs. Penrose. Some with affection, others with resentment. You were heard quarrelling with him only last week over the matter of Lydia's allowance." Eleanor's lips pressed tight, though she said nothing. "Then the Colonel," Miss Marple continued, "a man of temper and pride. Mr. Penrose was said to have discovered certain debts the Colonel incurred during his years in India. Debts the Colonel would rather not have made public. Arthur Penrose, I believe, threatened to expose him at dinner only a fortnight past." Ashworth puffed himself up, moustache bristling. "Idle gossip. I've nothing to hide. Yes, I owe a few pounds here and there, but so do most gentlemen. That is hardly a reason for murder." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said mildly. "And yet your boots, Colonel, suggest you were not confined to the billiard-room after all. Damp soil is rarely found on polished wood floors." The Colonel turned red, though whether from anger or alarm it was hard to say. "And finally," she said, her gaze resting on Lydia. "Young Lydia dependent upon her cousins for support. Mr. Penrose was a difficult man, was he not? Critical, demanding. And he held some power over you, I think. Perhaps he knew something you would rather keep secret." Lydia's breath quickened. "That's not true. He was unkind, yes, but I never wished him dead." She cast a fearful glance toward Eleanor, as though seeking protection, but Eleanor's eyes had hardened. Inspector Craythorne leaned forward. "Out with it, girl. What secret?" But Lydia only shook her head, tears brimming. Miss Marple let the silence stretch. Before speaking again, her voice soft, almost pitying. "3 motives, then. Money, pride, and fear. Each strong enough in its way, yet none alone explains the picture we are given. For what reason would any of you wish to stage the death as a locked-room puzzle? Why the teacup, so carefully placed? Why the open window, though it led nowhere? These are not the actions of a man struck down in sudden rage, but of someone weaving a story," the inspector grumbled. "And what story's that?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is what we must discover. But consider, staging requires time. One does not arrange a body, a key, and a teacup in haste. Which among them had time alone with Arthur after he left the table? Which could move unseen, without the others noticing?" The Colonel swore under his breath. "We've been over it. I was in the billiard-room. Eleanor here was with the guests. Lydia claims she retired early." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and therein lies the trouble. Lydia says she saw nothing at all, yet she looked at the teacup as though she recognized it. And Mrs. Penrose insists Arthur drank only brandy, yet the maid trembled when asked about tea, as though she knew more than she dared admit. And the Colonel, so insistent on his alibi, leaves muddy prints where none ought to be. The tangle was before them, each thread leading in a different direction. Eleanor with her financial dependence, the Colonel with his debts and pride, Lydia with her trembling secrecy. Each could have gained something from Arthur's death, yet none explained the staging of the scene, the locked door, the misplaced teacup. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The thing about human beings, Inspector, is that they rarely act from one motive alone. A man may strike in anger but cover it for fear of discovery. A woman may kill for money but tell herself it was justice, and the young, when desperate, may weave lies that serve two purposes at once. We must not ask which motive alone explains the crime, but how several motives woven together create the pattern before us. Craythorne frowned deeply, but Miss Marple's eyes had already turned inward, tracing the web of resentment, fear, and greed that bound the household together. The Blue Room murder was no crime of passion, nor was it a random act. It was deliberate, carefully arranged, a performance for the eyes of others, and someone in that room was clever enough, or foolish, enough to believe such a performance could endure. The maze of motives was tangled indeed, but to Jane Marple, every maze had a path through, if one only had the patience to follow each turn to its end. Inspector Craythorne was not a man to suffer mysteries patiently. By the second day at the Larches, his frustration had turned to determination, and when Sergeant Hadley came hurrying in with a scrap of cloth clutched in his hand, the inspector seized upon it as though it were salvation itself. "Found it, sir," Hadley said, his voice triumphant. In the shrubbery just below the Blue Room window, a handkerchief, blood-stained. The inspector snatched it up, holding it aloft for all to see. It was a gentleman's handkerchief, monogrammed faintly in one corner. C.A. Craythorne's eyes glinted. "Colonel Ashworth, unless some other fellow in this household carries your initials, this is damning indeed." The colonel turned crimson, spluttering. "I'll not stand for this outrage. Any man can drop a handkerchief. Why, I've half a dozen with my initials. This proves nothing." But the inspector, encouraged at last by something solid, was already dictating notes to Hadley. "The weapon may still be missing, but we've motive, debts, pride, and now evidence. The colonel quarrelled with Penrose, left the billiard room unseen, struck him down, and escaped through the window. When he realized the door had locked, he staged the scene, dropped his handkerchief in his flight, clear as day." The colonel bellowed, "Sheer nonsense, the window's 30 feet above ground. Do you think me an acrobat?" Miss Marple, who had been knitting serenely in the corner, laid her work aside. Her voice, quiet but firm, cut through the bluster. "Perhaps the inspector believes you climbed down the ivy, Colonel, though I dare say the strain might be considerable at your age." Craythorne gave her a sharp look. "We've no need of sarcasm, Miss Marple. The evidence speaks for itself." "Does I?" "It, indeed," she replied mildly. "Evidence does speak, Inspector, but it can also lie. So I've seen many a case in which the most obvious clue was the one most carefully planted. A handkerchief, left so neatly in the garden, may be less a discovery than an invitation." The inspector bristled. "You suggest someone planted this?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the others. Eleanor Penrose was very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the fire as though she dared not look anywhere else. Lydia Markham's face was pale, her lips parted as though she might speak, then closed again in silence. Only the colonel blustered and roared, his outrage loud and unrestrained. "I suggest only," Miss Marple said gently, "that criminals, like children, often rely on the obvious. A clue too perfect, too well-timed, is seldom trustworthy." But the inspector was in no mood to be swayed. "Colonel Ashworth, you'll remain in this house under guard until further notice. We'll take you into custody before the day is out." The colonel stormed about, cursing his fate, while Eleanor gave a delicate sigh of relief, as though some terrible strain had eased from her shoulders. Lydia's eyes flickered uncertainly between them, and Miss Marple, who missed little, saw the faintest twitch of satisfaction ghost across Eleanor's lips. It was a false victory, Miss Marple knew. The inspector, eager for resolution, had seized upon the handkerchief with all the fervour of a drowning man clutching driftwood. But there were threads yet untied. If Colonel Ashworth had struck the fatal blow, why the teacup? Why the carefully arranged key? Why the open window that led nowhere? The colonel was a man of temper, yes, but not of elaborate cunning. He would have barked his quarrel aloud, struck in the open, and left the body where it fell. This locked room tableau bore another's hand entirely. Later that evening, Miss Marple wandered into the garden, her umbrella tapping softly along the wet gravel paths. She paused beneath the blue room window, peering up at the ivy. True, it might bear a man's weight, but fresh rain had made the stems slick, the soil beneath treacherous. A man of the colonel's build attempting such a descent would leave. More than a scrap of cloth behind, broken ivy, torn threads, mud scattered on the sill. Yet the window's ledge was clean, save for the faint smudge of soil she had noticed before, too slight for a desperate escape. No, the handkerchief had been placed deliberately, as one might drop a trail of crumbs for others to follow. And someone, in that house, someone calmer, colder, was watching as the inspector congratulated himself, content to let the colonel take the fall. Miss Marple returned indoors, where Eleanor Penrose was instructing Clara, the maid, to bring in more coal for the fire. Her tone was sharp, her manner brisk, too brisk for a woman who had lost her brother scarcely a day before. Lydia, meanwhile, had retreated to a corner with a book she did not read, her eyes darting often toward the hall. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts spinning faster than her needles. It was not yet time to speak. Too soon, and the real criminal would only burrow deeper into the shadows. But she had learned long ago that murderers, like moths, cannot resist circling the flame of their own deception. They would strike again, not with another blow perhaps, but with another mistake. And so, as Inspector Craythorne prepared his papers, convinced the case was all but closed, Miss Marple sat quietly, her eyes shining with quiet certainty. The real killer was still at large, watching, waiting, and preparing their next move. The false victory belonged to the police. The true battle had only just begun. The rain had ceased by morning, leaving the larches shrouded in a damp mist that curled like smoke over the garden. The house was quiet, but it was not the stillness of peace. It was the tense silence of people waiting for a verdict they did not quite believe in. Colonel Ashworth had been confined to a guest chamber under guard, though his booming protests echoed through the corridors whenever a constable passed. Inspector Craythorne, convinced of his triumph, was drafting his report in the library. Miss Marple, however, sat at a small writing desk near the window, her knitting set aside for once. Her gaze lingered on the garden paths where the constables had tramped the day before, muddy footprints now hardened into the gravel. Something gnawed at her mind, not the crime itself, but the curious neatness with which the evidence had arranged itself. The handkerchief with its initials, the locked door, the teacup, each clue too deliberate, too obvious. She had seen such neatness before. Her memory, sharp as ever despite her years, tugged her back to a case she had heard of long ago in another village. A quarrelsome bachelor had been found dead in his study, a single glass of port beside him, though he despised the drink. The constable at the time had declared it a robbery gone wrong, but Miss Marple, visiting a cousin nearby, had noticed a curious detail. The dead man had kept his study meticulously neat, yet the drawer where his late sister's letters were stored had been rifled through. No jewelry had been stolen, no money taken, only those letters which later proved to contain proof of a scandalous liaison the family wished to keep buried. Letters, secrets, a household where appearances mattered. More than truth. Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. She rose, moving slowly toward the shelves of books in the drawing-room. Arthur Penrose, too, had kept his affairs in precise order. Yet in the blue room she had seen one drawer of his escritoire left, slightly ajar as though hastily closed. The inspector had dismissed it. Men are careless creatures, he had said, but Miss Marple knew Arthur Penrose was not careless. He was proud, particular, and jealous of his possessions. If a drawer was open, it had been opened with purpose. Later that day, she took the opportunity to speak with Clara, the maid, in the scullery. Clara's hands were raw from scrubbing, her eyes wary. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, coaxing. "You've served the Penroses long?" "3 years, ma'am." "And Mr. Penrose, he was a man of temper, wasn't he?" Clara's lips pressed. Thin, but at last she nodded. "Yes, ma'am, fierce temper, especially with Miss Lydia, always quarrelling with her." "Quarrelling? Over what, I wonder?" The girl hesitated. "I don't rightly know, ma'am, but he'd call her names, said she was her mother's daughter, and that blood will out. I never understood it." Miss Marple thanked her softly, but her mind was already racing. Her mother's daughter. That phrase carried weight. She recalled dimly whispers from years past. Scandal in London, a Penrose cousin who had married poorly, disastrously, and whose child had been brought up quietly in the country. Could Lydia be that child? Returning to the drawing-room, Miss Marple observed Lydia closely as the girl bent over a book she did not read. Her fair head was bowed, but when Eleanor addressed her sharply, Lydia flinched like a scolded child. Eleanor's protectiveness toward her cousin had been fierce, almost unnatural, and Arthur Penrose, proud to the last, had despised weakness, impropriety, illegitimacy. If Lydia bore the shadow of some family disgrace, then Arthur would have held it over her. That night, as the house settled, Miss Marple ventured once more into the blue room with Inspector Craythorne's reluctant permission. The chamber was cold, its furniture stiff and unyielding. She opened the escritoire drawer that had been ajar. Inside, neatly stacked, were letters, some recent, others yellowed with age. She took up the topmost. The ink was faded, but the name at the bottom was unmistakable: Catherine Markham, Lydia's mother. The letter spoke of desperation, debts, shame, and a plea for help that Arthur Penrose had coldly ignored. Other letters hinted at scandal, a marriage without blessing, a child unacknowledged. And tucked between them, a more recent note in Arthur's heavy hand: "You will pay for your mother's sins. Do not think you can escape them. Blood is blood, and disgrace cannot be washed away." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and replaced it. The room seemed colder than before. Now the threads were knitting themselves together. Lydia's fear, Eleanor's protectiveness, Arthur's cruelty. It was not only about money or temper. It was about old sins, long buried, rising to the surface. At breakfast the next morning, Eleanor sat stiff-backed, her teacup rattling faintly in its saucer. The inspector was crowing over his forthcoming triumph. But Miss Marple, pouring her tea with steady hand, spoke in her mildest tone. "Families are such complicated things, are they not? Old quarrels linger long after they ought to have been forgotten. I was only just remembering poor Catherine Markham, Lydia's mother. Such a sad story." The effect was immediate. Eleanor froze, her hand tightening on the cup until it cracked against the saucer. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, spilling silently down her cheeks. The inspector blinked, uncomprehending, but Miss Marple saw what she needed. The murder in the blue room was no isolated act of violence. It was the last chapter in a story begun decades earlier, when Catherine Markham's choices had divided the family and left scars that Arthur Penrose never forgave. His death was rooted in that past, in grudges nurtured like weeds, in shame, passed down like an heirloom, and now the past had come to claim him. The shadows that lingered in the larches were not merely of the present crime, but of old wrongs, old secrets. And Miss Marple, who had long since learned that people never escape the patterns of their past, knew she was closer to the heart of the mystery than ever. The atmosphere in the larches had begun to curdle. What had first been a tense house of mourning was now a crucible of suspicion. Meals were barely touched, conversations dwindled to stiff formalities, and even the servants moved about as though conscious of unseen eyes upon them. Inspector Craythorne was content with his neat narrative, the colonel in custody, the evidence tidy and complete. But Miss Marple, with her knitting once again in hand, knew that neatness was a false friend. The truth, she had learned long ago, rarely presents itself so obligingly. Yet how to uncover the hidden thread? Evidence, in the inspector's sense, was exhausted: fingerprints, alibis, statements. But human beings were never so orderly. They betrayed themselves in a glance, a hesitation, a slip of the tongue. One need only find the right stimulus, the right little test to make the mask slip. That afternoon she sat quietly in the drawing room while Eleanor read the newspaper aloud to Lydia. Lydia listened with downcast eyes, her fingers plucking nervously at her sleeve. Eleanor's voice was too loud, too deliberate, as though determined to drown out any other thoughts. Geoffrey lingered nearby, restless, pretending to study the chessboard that had been left on a side table. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Without looking up, she spoke in her mildest, most unthreatening tone. "Young people do amuse me sometimes, so very sure of themselves. Why, I recall once in St. Mary Mead, a girl tried to conceal that she had broken her mother's treasured verse. And do you know, it was the simplest trick that revealed her. We laid out all the pieces on the table, and I said, quite carelessly, that one piece bore a mark which would show who had touched it last. The poor girl nearly fainted and confessed at once. Eleanor smiled thinly. Children are foolish. Indeed, said Miss Marple, but grown people too betray themselves in the same way. When one is guilty, one cannot help but look to the very place where one fears discovery. She paused, allowing the silence to draw tight. Then, with apparent casualness, she nodded toward the escritoire in the corner, the very one in which Arthur Penrose's letters had been kept. It is curious, is it not, how drawers so often tell their own story. The merest smudge of dust, where a hand has rested, the faintest trace of perfume clinging to a scrap of paper. One wonders what Mr. Penrose himself might have wished to keep hidden there. It was then that she saw it, Eleanor's eyes flickering just for a heartbeat to the escritoire before she quickly forced her gaze back to her newspaper. Lydia shrank lower in her chair, while Geoffrey turned pale beneath his restless energy. It was not a confession, but it was enough. A collective shudder of awareness, a crack in the wall of secrecy. The inspector, who had been hovering at the doorway, snorted. "Old wives' tales, Miss Marple. Furniture and dust marks indeed. We have the Colonel's handkerchief, the quarrel, the opportunity." "Perhaps, Inspector," said Miss Marple softly, "but I've always found that people's reactions are the truest evidence of all." That evening she contrived another little test. When the household gathered reluctantly in the drawing-room after supper, she suggested in her mild and slightly dithering way that they indulge in a little diversion to pass the dreary hours. "A game of sorts," she said. "You will think me foolish, of course, but in St. Mary Mead we sometimes play a parlour trick. One tells a story of a crime, perhaps, something invented, and the others must say how they think it ends. One learns so much about a person's way of thinking from the endings they propose." Geoffrey laughed nervously. "Sounds childish." "Childish things," Miss Marple replied gently, "often reveal very grown-up truths." And so she began, her voice light and almost whimsical. "Once in a small house there lived a man most disagreeable, who lorded it over his family. One night he was found dead in his room. There were 3 people who might have done it. One who feared him, one who hated him, and one who depended on him for everything. Now how do you suppose the story ends?" Lydia looked stricken. I don't know. Perhaps it was an accident?" "An interesting idea," Miss Marple said kindly. Eleanor, her face set and proud, declared, "The one who hated him did. It, naturally. Hatred festers until it must act. There is no mystery in that." Geoffrey, fidgeting with the chess pieces on the side table, muttered, "No, it would be the dependent one." "Fear drives people to strange measures when their security is threatened." Miss Marple nodded at each answer, smiling her vague smile, but within her, the pieces were aligning. Eleanor, fierce and uncompromising, pointed to hatred because she herself hated Arthur most bitterly and wanted that hatred seen as motive enough. Geoffrey, anxious about his inheritance and position, projected his own fears onto the dependent character. Lydia, poor child, wished desperately for it all to be dismissed as an accident, as though wishing could make it so. It was not proof, of course, but it was a pattern, human psychology laid bare beneath the surface of a silly game. The reactions were too telling, too raw to ignore. Later, when the others had retired, Miss Marple lingered in the empty drawing-room. She touched the chessboard Geoffrey had abandoned. The Black King had been toppled over, lying prone among the pawns. She righted it gently, her face grave. "They are all playing a game, in their own way," she thought. "But only one knows how the story truly ends. And that one has already begun to betray themselves. The unconventional clue was not a scrap of evidence, nor a fingerprint, nor even a witness statement. It was the human heart itself, betraying, in the flicker of an eye, and the choice of an E, ending to a tale, more truth than any police inquiry could wring out. And Miss Marple, sitting alone in the dim lamplight, knew she was drawing closer. The murderer was clever, but cleverness never quite accounts for the ordinary wisdom of an old woman who had watched human nature all her life. Sooner or later, the mask would slip completely. It was a day heavy with fog, the kind that pressed close against the windows of the larches and swallowed every sound into its grey embrace. Within the house the atmosphere was no less oppressive. What had once been grief now carried an undertone of dread, a shared knowledge that the murderer still moved freely among them. Miss Marple, though outwardly calm, had begun to feel the pressure of time. Inspector Craythorne remained stubborn, in his confidence that Colonel Penrose was the guilty party, but his neat case was crumbling in her eyes. The Colonel's bluster and temper, while inconvenient, did not add up to murder. There was something subtler at play, something that whispered from beneath the ordinary surfaces of this household, and then came the blow. That morning the inspector burst into the drawing-room, red-faced with fury. "Gone!" he barked, thumping a fist onto the mantelpiece. The letters, every last one of them, vanished from the escritoire. Eleanor gasped, rising from her chair. Vanished? How could they have vanished? They were locked away. Locked, yes, Craythorne snapped. But someone had the key, or forced the drawer without leaving a sign. Either way, the letters are gone. Miss Marple laid down her knitting, her eyes narrowing slightly, though her expression remained mild. The letters, Arthur Penrose's, correspondence, were the closest thing to a thread tying the suspects together. They hinted at debts, secrets, and obligations long concealed. To have them suddenly disappear was no coincidence. Someone had understood their significance, perhaps, more clearly than even the inspector himself. "Letters are troublesome things," Miss Marple murmured. "They so often outlive the moment in which they were written. One thinks a matter forgotten, but paper has a way of remembering what people would rather it did not." Eleanor's lips pressed thin. Geoffrey muttered something about the servants, though his voice lacked conviction. Lydia looked stricken, twisting her hands in her lap. Craythorne paced. "This is deliberate interference, obstruction of justice. Someone in this house is playing a very dangerous game." Miss Marple's eyes, seemingly absent-minded, wandered over the group. It was not the loss of the letters that concerned her. Most, it was the reactions. Eleanor stood too still, as though willing herself to seem calm. Geoffrey's restless movements betrayed an inward panic. Lydia's trembling might have been sorrow, but Miss Marple sensed another shade to it. Fear of being exposed. The disappearance of the letters shifted the ground beneath them. Where there had been suspicion, there was now something sharper, a sense of active danger. Whoever had taken them was not merely hiding their past. They were ready to act, even to risk discovery, in order to keep the truth buried. That evening, Miss Marple walked the halls of the Larches more slowly than usual, her sharp old eyes noting every detail. The escritoire still bore a faint scent of polish, too recently applied, as if someone had tried to disguise the tampering. A careless smudge of ash lingered near the grate, as though a scrap of paper had been hurriedly burned there. But not thoroughly. She bent, taking up a small corner of charred parchment from the hearth. Only a fragment of ink remained, curling across the singed edge. It was impossible to read the whole sentence, but one word lingered, faint yet distinct. Inheritance. She slipped it into her handkerchief. So the letters had not merely been stolen. At least one of them had been destroyed, and the subject of inheritance, she suspected, was not a coincidence. When she returned to the drawing-room, she found Geoffrey there, alone, pacing in restless circles. He started when he saw her, then forced a laugh. "Ah, Miss Marple, this business is enough to make anyone jumpy, eh? That blundering inspector will have us all locked up before long." "Perhaps," she said mildly, "but then only those with something to fear need worry." His laugh cracked in the middle, and he excused himself with hasty steps. Later, when the family gathered again, Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "I have often thought," she said, "that when evidence disappears, it is not always to conceal the crime itself, but to protect some other truth linked to it. A person may endure suspicion, perhaps even endure gossip, but certain secrets, once revealed, could unravel everything." Eleanor's voice rang sharp. "You imply that one of us has tampered with the evidence. That is outrageous." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "Outrageous, yes, but perhaps also true." The room fell into silence. Each face bore the strain of unspoken fear. The vanishing letters had transformed the investigation into something darker, more personal. Trust, already fragile, now seemed impossible. Even the inspector, puffed up with his authority, began to cast nervous glances about the room as though unsure who might be working against him. Miss Marple understood then that the game had changed. The murderer, or their accomplice, was no longer content to sit back and hope. They were intervening, actively shaping the course of events. And that meant they were afraid. And fear, Miss Marple knew, was the surest sign of guilt. That night, long after the lamps had been extinguished and the household settled into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple sat awake in her small guest chamber. The fog pressed against the window, muffling the world into silence. She laid the charred scrap of parchment before her, the single word inheritance staring back in mute accusation. The crime had roots in the past, yes, but its branches reached into the future. Someone feared what Arthur Penrose's letters might reveal. Something that would threaten their claim, their standing, perhaps even their freedom. That fear had driven them to theft and destruction, and it would drive them still further if pressed. Miss Marple folded the scrap away with great care. She knew the danger now was not only in uncovering the truth, but in surviving long enough to speak it aloud. For the murderer had shown their hand. They would not hesitate to act again. And as she finally laid her head upon the pillow, Miss Marple whispered softly into the stillness, "Yes, my dear Arthur, you were right to hide your secrets, but it seems someone was even more determined to bury them forever." The fog that had haunted the larches for days finally began to thin, but it left behind an air of clammy unease, as though the house itself sweated under the strain of hidden secrets. Every corridor felt like a trap, every shadow a place where whispers might lurk. Miss Marple had not slept well. She had lain awake, considering the vanished letters, the charred scrap she had salvaged, and the word inheritance curling across its edge. Morning brought her no clarity, only the knowledge that someone in the house had acted decisively to bury the truth. But what came that day was more than concealment. It was escalation. The first sign of trouble came with a scream, a piercing, ragged cry that cut through the stillness of breakfast like a knife. Eleanor dropped her spoon, broth spilling across the white cloth, while Geoffrey leapt to his feet, knocking over his chair. "It came from the west corridor," Lydia gasped, her face drained of colour. They hurried together, Inspector Craythorne thundering ahead with his constable in tow. Miss Marple followed at her own measured pace, her lips pressed thin, her eyes sharper than ever. She had a dreadful inkling of what they might find. At the far end of the corridor near the old library, the maid Annie stood trembling, her hands clutched against her apron. She pointed toward the open door, unable to speak. Inside, the scene was ghastly. Colonel Penrose, red-faced, blustering, so full of crude vitality only yesterday, now lay sprawled upon the rug, his eyes wide and glassy, his throat marked by a cruel purple bruise. A decanter lay shattered near his outflung hand, the sharp scent of brandy mingling with the unmistakable metallic tang of violence. "Good Lord," Craythorne muttered, bending over the body. "Strangled, and not long ago." He straightened, his expression both fierce and shaken. "The murderer is here, in this house, and bold enough to strike again under our very noses." Eleanor clutched Lydia for support, her breath coming. In short, jagged gasps. Geoffrey swore under his breath, then quickly tried to disguise the slip with a show of outrage. Miss Marple stepped closer, peering at the body with a kind of grave sadness. "The Colonel," she murmured. "He was not a gentleman, but even so, death is a pitiful thing." She noted the details others ignored. The overturned chair, the cuff of his sleeve damp with spilled brandy, the faint mark upon his wrist where something thin and sharp had pressed. There was resistance here. He had struggled. The inspector was already barking orders, commanding the servants to account for their whereabouts. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered not on the body, but on the faces of the living. Eleanor's horror was sincere, yet beneath it flickered another emotion, perhaps relief, quickly buried. Lydia was pale, too pale, as if the death had struck, some private terror in her heart. And Geoffrey, though outwardly furious, carried in his eyes the look of a man calculating what this death meant for him. Whoever had killed Arthur Penrose's brother had now doubled their crime. The noose was tightening, but around whose neck? By afternoon, the household had dissolved into suspicion and panic. The servants whispered in corners. Eleanor retreated to her chambers, claiming illness. Lydia wept openly, though she gave no explanation for her tears. Geoffrey prowled the halls like a caged beast, alternately declaring the murderer would be caught and muttering that they were all doomed. Miss Marple, quietly knitting in the drawing-room, appeared absorbed in her work, yet her mind spun swiftly. A second murder changed everything. It suggested not desperation alone, but design. Colonel Penrose had been the inspector's favoured suspect. His death was no accident. Someone had removed him from the board, clearing suspicion from themselves while throwing the investigation into chaos. And then there was the method. Strangulation. Intimate, deliberate, and cruel. A crime of closeness. Not something a stranger would risk within the walls of a watched house. That evening, when the household was gathered under Craythorne's stern eye, Miss Marple spoke gently. "It seems to me," she said, "that the second crime is not separate from the first, but rather its continuation. The same hand that struck down poor Mr. Penrose has now silenced his brother. And one must ask, what was it the Colonel knew or might have revealed that made him so dangerous to the murderer? The silence that followed was thick with unspoken fear. Eleanor's lips trembled as she whispered, "You mean it isn't over?" Miss Marple looked at her kindly, though her words were grave. "No, my dear, I fear it is only just beginning." That night, the atmosphere in the house grew taut as wire. Inspector Craythorne doubled the guard, placing constables in the corridors, yet Miss Marple felt no safer. The killer had already proven cunning enough to steal letters under lock and key, bold enough to kill again within hours of the discovery. As she retired to her chamber, she found her door ajar. She was certain she had closed it earlier. Stepping softly inside, she scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place. Her shawl lay neatly folded, her bag untouched. But upon her bedside table sat her knitting basket, its contents disturbed. The needles laid out in a peculiar, deliberate cross. She drew in a quiet breath. It was not theft this time. It was a message. Someone had entered her room, knowing she would notice the change. A warning, perhaps, or a threat. Miss Marple sat heavily on the bed, folding her hands together to still their trembling. She had always known she was walking close to danger, but now the danger was walking close to her. The murderer understood that she saw too much, thought too keenly. But she also understood something vital in return. The killer was afraid. Afraid enough to kill twice, afraid enough to threaten her. And fear, she knew, was a weakness that could be used. The next morning dawned clear, a cruel contrast to the darkness of the night before. Colonel Penrose's body had been removed, but the shadow of his death lingered in every corner. Inspector Craythorne announced with grim satisfaction that no one would be permitted to leave the Larches. "The murderer is among us," he declared. "We will have the truth, or we will have another corpse." Miss Marple, gazing at the drawn, pale faces around her, feared the inspector might prove correct on both counts. The game had turned deadly. The murderer was not merely concealing a crime. They were silencing anyone who might stand in their way. And as she resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the tense silence, Miss Marple resolved one thing. She must find the truth. Quickly, before the killer struck again. For the unexpected twist was not only the second murder, it was the chilling certainty that the villain was still at large, cleverer than the rest, and willing to kill again to stay hidden. The house had grown restless in its grief. The corridors of the larches seemed longer than they had before, every step echoing as though the walls themselves listened. Servants hurried in silence, refusing to meet one another's eyes. Even the air felt thick, as if the fog outside had seeped indoors, settling into every corner and making the truth harder. See. Inspector Craythorne stormed from room to room, determined to pin down the murderer with blunt force and barking interrogations. He had Eleanor in tears, Geoffrey snapping with impatience, Lydia retreating further into herself. Yet for all his thunder, he uncovered little. The more noise he made, the quieter the truth became. Miss Marple, by contrast, did not rage or press. She sat, calm as a cat at the hearth, letting the silence reveal its secrets. For she had begun to sense a rhythm in the chaos, a faint but steady thread weaving through all that had happened. It began with a glove. She noticed it on the console table in the drawing room, a man's leather glove, creased with wear. There was nothing remarkable in that, save for one thing. It was a left glove, and earlier that day she had seen its right companion in the hall near the library. Not carelessly dropped, but tucked half-hidden behind a chair leg, as though it had been kicked there in haste, a trivial matter, one might think. But Miss Marple did not believe in trivialities. If something was displaced, it was displaced for a reason. Later, as she sat knitting, Lydia passed by, murmuring distractedly about needing fresh air. The girl had wrung her hands until her knuckles blanched, and in doing so she revealed another thread, a faint line of red across her wrist, hastily covered by a cuff. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as her mind arranged these scraps. A misplaced glove, a mark upon a wrist, a decanter shattered near Colonel Penrose's hand, and then there was the oddest thing of all, the broken clock. 2 nights prior, as they had gathered in the drawing room, Geoffrey had muttered that the mantel clock had been useless for days. Yet Miss Marple recalled distinctly that on the very afternoon before the first murder, she had heard it chiming the hour as she passed. She remembered it well, for the chime was a note too shrill, and it had made her pause. Why then would Geoffrey insist it was broken? She set down her knitting, her heart beginning to quicken. Details, trifles, whispers, all the things others dismissed were now knitting themselves together in her mind. That evening she sought the library where Colonel Penrose had been found. The room still smelled faintly of brandy and smoke, though the body had long since been taken away. She examined the space slowly, as if it were a tapestry and she was following the stitch of one particular thread. Her gaze fell upon the hearthrug. It had been shifted almost imperceptibly. She crouched down, her old bones creaking in protest, and lifted its edge. Beneath lay a faint smear, half cleaned but not erased, a trace of wax, pale and stubborn against the dark wood. Candle wax. Yet there had been no candle burning in that room on the night of the murder. She would have noticed. Everyone would. Miss Marple straightened, her expression grave. The pattern was forming. A false clock, a hidden glove, a wax stain. Each a fragment. Together, a picture. Someone had been staging scenes, arranging the appearance of chance where none existed. The glove moved to suggest a hasty struggle. The clock declared broken to obscure a timeline. The wax revealed a light source brought secretly, for stealth, or perhaps for ritual. It was no random chaos. It was choreography. She did not speak of it yet, not to Craythorne, who would scoff, nor to the household, already frayed to breaking. Instead, she returned to her seat in the drawing room, her knitting set once more in motion, and as she watched the others, the pattern became clearer still. Eleanor, always fluttering, always anxious, had grown quieter since the Colonel's death, as, if freed from a pressure she dared not name. Geoffrey, restless, prowled the room, but his glances often strayed toward the writing desk, where the family's correspondence was usually kept. Lydia avoided both of them, her eyes red from crying, yet once or twice Miss Marple caught her, watching the inspector with something close to dread. Each of them moved according to a design, conscious or not. Fear made them predictable, and in their predictability the truth peeked through. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple recalled an old case from years ago in St. Mary Mead. Small, humble, easily forgotten. A woman had misplaced her hatpin, and only much later did it emerge that the misplacement had been deliberate, a cover for theft. It had taught her then what she saw now, that the key to deception was not in grand gestures, but in small contradictions. A glove, out of place, a clock that chimed when it should not, a wax stain beneath a rug. She whispered softly to herself, "It has been in plain sight all along. The murderer's hand was clever but not flawless. They had arranged the stage too carefully, forgetting that old eyes see what younger ones overlook." The next morning the household gathered once more under Inspector Craythorne's sharp command. The tension had grown unbearable, like a storm waiting to break. Miss Marple, serene amidst the storm, laid down her knitting and cleared her throat gently. "I think," she said in her mild, grandmotherly voice, "that we have been looking at this all quite the wrong way. We have thought of these events as accidents of timing, of opportunity, of passion run amok. But they are not accidents, they are pieces of a pattern carefully arranged." The room fell silent. Even Craythorne stilled, curiosity prickling despite his skepticism. "What pattern?" he demanded. Miss Marple's eyes moved from face to face, lingering for a moment on Geoffrey, then on Lydia, then on Eleanor, before resting at last on the inspector himself. "That, Inspector," she said softly, "I believe I am very close to telling you. But first, we must look not at what is missing, but at what is too carefully placed." The hush that followed was heavy, expectant, fearful. For the first time those gathered seemed to sense that the truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It was rising, slowly, inexorably, from the very details they had overlooked. And though Miss Marple did not yet name the murderer, she knew that the weave of lies was tightening. The pattern had emerged, and with it the beginning of the end. The household awoke to a brittle quiet, the kind that comes after too many nights of suspicion. Sleep had not refreshed them. It had only deepened the shadows under their eyes. They moved about like ghosts in their own home, glancing at one another with veiled distrust. Inspector Craythorne had grown more irritable by the hour, snapping at servants and shuffling papers as though the sheer force of his frustration might conjure the solution. He wanted the murderer to be greedy or jealous or simply opportunistic. He wanted the case to fit into a neat frame of motive and means. But Miss Marple knew otherwise. The pattern she had traced did not point to simple greed or vengeance. It pointed inward towards something more unsettling, a reason rooted not in circumstance but in the heart itself. That morning, she requested a private word with Eleanor Penrose. They met in the small morning room, where sunlight filtered weakly through lace curtains, making Eleanor's skin look as pale as porcelain. She clutched a handkerchief in trembling fingers. "My dear," Miss Marple began gently, "I wonder if you might help me understand something. Your late husband was rather strict with his household, was he not?" Eleanor's eyes darted toward the door before she answered. "Strict? He was commanding. He believed in order. He did not tolerate weakness." She swallowed hard. "Especially not in me." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly in her lap. "And yet I cannot help but notice that since his death you seem less afraid." At this, Eleanor broke. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips, but her sobs escaped regardless. "You don't understand what it was like, Miss Marple. The Colonel, he had a temper. Behind closed doors, there was no kindness, no mercy. He controlled everything. Every letter I wrote, every step I took. And he always reminded me what would happen if I defied him." Miss Marple's heart ached, though her expression remained serene. She had seen such marriages before, though rarely spoken of. In villages and in drawing rooms, cruelty could wear the mask of respectability. "But," Eleanor whispered, lowering her voice, "I did not kill him. I could not. I prayed for deliverance, but I could never—" Her words dissolved into tears. Miss Marple touched her hand, softly. She believed her. Later, she spoke with Lydia, the Colonel's niece, in the garden, where the damp fog hung low. Among the hedges, Lydia had grown wary, her once sharp tongue subdued. "You saw the quarrel that night, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Geoffrey and my uncle. Geoffrey was furious, red in the face, fists clenched. He threatened him, I swear it. Said he'd had enough of the Colonel's interference." "And what?" Interference was that. For a long moment, Lydia looked at the ground. My uncle had found out about Geoffrey's debts. He said he would expose him, disgrace him before everyone. But it wasn't just that, it was... She bit her lip, her voice lowering. The Colonel was always meddling. He took pleasure in controlling people's weaknesses, like a cat toying. With mice. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Yes, I believe he did. Lydia straightened, a sudden flare of bitterness lighting her features. Do you know what it is to live under someone who twists every vulnerability you have? To have no secrets of your own because he'll dig them out and use them against you? Yes, Miss Marple murmured. I know that kind of cruelty, and I know it can drive people to desperate lengths. By evening, Miss Marple had gathered enough threads to see the full tapestry. She sat once more in the drawing-room as the household assembled. The atmosphere was taut, brittle as glass. Inspector Craythorne stood by the mantel, impatient. Well, Miss Marple, you've hinted and muttered long enough. Do you claim to know the truth at last? The old lady inclined her head. Not all. Starve it, Inspector, but enough. Her eyes moved over the faces before her. Eleanor pale, Geoffrey restless, Lydia stiff with anxiety. Each of them waiting, dreading. We have all assumed, Miss Marple began, that this crime was committed for something simple. Money, inheritance, or a petty grudge. But that is not the case. The true motive runs deeper. It is not greed, nor revenge, nor even fear alone. It is the desire for freedom. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. She went on, her voice calm but cutting. Colonel Penrose made himself the master of every soul in this house. He controlled through intimidation, through secrets uncovered and exploited. He ruled by fear, and he delighted in it. Each of you was caught in his web, Eleanor in her marriage, Geoffrey in his debts, Lydia in her past missteps. To him, your pain was power, and so one of you, at last, chose to break free. Eleanor gasped, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth. Geoffrey blanched, his hands curling into fists. Lydia's eyes glittered with unshed tears. Craythorne barked, Words! Miss Marple, pretty speeches don't prove a thing. Who had the will to kill him? Miss Marple turned her gaze slowly. That, Inspector, is the cruelest part, because each of them had motive enough, not for gain but for release. The silence that followed was suffocating, but Miss Marple was not finished. She leaned forward slightly, her knitting needles resting in her lap. What matters most is not that the Colonel was killed, but how carefully the scene was staged. The broken clock, the glove out of place, the wax upon the floor, all contrived to confuse us. That is not the work of someone lashing out in panic. It is the work of someone who wished not merely to be free, but to reshape the truth itself. Her gaze lingered at last on Geoffrey. You feared exposure. Your debts, your shame, they were weapons in the Colonel's hands. He meant to ruin you. And so you struck first. But you did not strike only to save yourself. You struck because you wanted to erase him, to undo the years of humiliation. That is why you staged the room. You wanted the story of his death to be yours to control, as he had controlled every story of your life. Geoffrey's face drained of color. His mouth opened as though to protest, but no sound emerged. Lydia's hand flew to her lips. Eleanor gave a faint cry, and for the first time Inspector Craythorne's bluster faltered. Miss Marple's voice softened. This was not a murder for inheritance. It was not even hatred in the common sense. It was the desperate act of a man who could not bear to live another day under his uncle's shadow. A crime born not of greed but of broken pride. The room seemed to shrink around Geoffrey. He looked wildly from one face to another, cornered by truths too sharp to escape. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. You don't know what it was like. He laughed at me, mocked me. Every time I tried to stand on my own, he crushed me. He said I'd never be more than a failure, that I'd die penniless, a disgrace. I couldn't... His words choked. I couldn't let him do it again. I couldn't. The confession hung heavy in the air, not triumphant, but tragic. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The motive had indeed been revealed, ugly, sorrowful, and more human than any of them had expected. Freedom, pride, the desperate hunger to reclaim a life once crushed. It was not greed or revenge alone that had driven the hand. It was the terrible need to escape a prison invisible to the world, yet all too real to its captive. And that, Miss Marple thought sadly, was a motive as deadly as any fortune. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, rattling. The windows of Penrose Manor with heavy rain and sudden gusts of wind. The household was gathered once more in the drawing-room, summoned by Miss Marple with the calm insistence of someone who knew her work was nearly finished. Inspector Craythorne stood with arms crossed, his patience worn thin. "I trust you've not dragged us all down here again for more riddles, Miss Marple. We need a conclusion, not another sermon." The old lady gave him a patient smile. "Yes, Inspector. Tonight we shall have a conclusion." Her needles clicked together in her lap, though no thread ran between them. The little pantomime of her knitting seemed to soothe her thoughts, even as it unsettled those watching. Geoffrey Penrose leaned against the mantel, restless, his face drawn and shadowed. Lydia sat stiffly in a chair by the fire, her fingers twisted together. Eleanor, pale and trembling, seemed scarcely able to meet anyone's eyes. Miss Marple's voice, when she began, was quiet, almost conversational. "Murder is a dreadful thing, you know, but it rarely happens without reason. The most dangerous motives are not the obvious ones. Money, jealousy, revenge, they can be resisted. But when a person feels their very self is threatened, when pride and freedom are stripped away, then I am afraid they may do anything." Her eyes lifted, fixing on Geoffrey. "And so it was, Mr. Penrose. You killed your uncle." The words rang out like a pistol shot. Eleanor gasped audibly. Lydia shifted in her seat as though struck. Geoffrey gave a sharp laugh, though his voice shook. "Really, Miss Marple, this is absurd. Do you expect us to take your village gossip as evidence?" Craythorne folded his arms more tightly, but his expression wavered. "I expect," Miss Marple said calmly, "that you will listen. You see, Geoffrey, your uncle made a game of breaking people. He knew of your debts. He held them over you, made certain you never forgot your dependence. On the night he died, he told you he meant to expose you publicly, to ruin you. That is when you decided to act." "Lies," Geoffrey snapped, though his eyes darted toward Lydia, then away. Miss Marple continued as though he hadn't spoken. "You struck him with the poker, but you feared suspicion would fall upon you. So you staged the room, the broken clock, the glove misplaced, the wax upon the floor. Clever little tricks to scatter suspicion, but too clever. They spoke not of panic, but of calculation." Geoffrey's face flushed crimson. "You've no proof." "No?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then perhaps we might speak of the candle." A hush fell. Rain lashed against the windows. The candle in the Colonel's study had burned down almost to the nub, Miss Marple said softly. Yet the wax trail upon the carpet was fresh, still pliant when we discovered it. Someone melted that candle, deliberately after his death, to suggest he had fallen asleep while it burned. That someone was you. Geoffrey stiffened, his composure slipping. "And then," Miss Marple added, "there is the matter of the glove. It was left so carelessly, yet only one glove. Why one? Because the other you still wore when you struck the blow. When I examined the poker, I found no fingerprints, only a faint smudge of leather oil." Lydia gasped. Eleanor pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple's voice did not rise, but its calm precision pressed down like a weight. "You see, Mr. Penrose, the truth does not need a confession. It is already written in the details you overlooked." The room seemed to contract around Geoffrey. His breath quickened. He looked to the inspector, but Craythorne's face was grim now, no longer dismissive. "This is ridiculous." Geoffrey burst out. "She's spinning tales, can't you see that? Old woman's fantasies." Miss Marple interrupted, her tone suddenly firm. "Then why, Mr. Penrose, did you attempt to move the body?" The colour drained from his face. "What? You thought the position awkward, did you not?" she went on. "The Colonel had slumped to the side, making it appear almost too staged. You tried to adjust him, but the drag mark on the carpet, faint though it was, betrayed you. It was there for anyone observant enough to see. The Colonel did not die where we found him. You placed him there. The silence that followed was suffocating." Geoffrey's mouth opened, closed, then twisted into a snarl. "You meddling hag," he spat. "You think you can ruin me? You think you're clever?" Inspector Craythorne stepped forward. "Careful, sir." Geoffrey's hand shot toward the poker by the hearth. Lydia cried out. Eleanor shrieked. For one dreadful moment it seemed the young man might strike out wildly in desperation, but Miss Marple did not flinch. She sat serenely, her clear eyes fixed upon him. "Violence will not save you, Mr. Penrose. It never does." Something in her calm, unyielding, unafraid, stopped him. His hand hovered over the poker, then fell uselessly to his side. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. Craythorne moved swiftly then, seizing Geoffrey by the arm. "That's enough. You'll answer for this in proper custody." Geoffrey sagged in his grip, all fight draining away. His face was pale, his eyes burning with fury and shame. "He deserved it," he muttered, voice breaking. "You don't know what it was like. He destroyed me long before I touched him. I only wanted to end it." Miss Marple's expression was gentle, though sorrow clouded her eyes. "Yes, I believe you, but murder never frees, Mr. Penrose. It only binds you tighter." The room exhaled as though released from a spell. Eleanor sank into her chair, trembling, tears streaking her face. Lydia sat rigid, staring at her cousin with a mixture of horror and pity. Inspector Craythorne called for his constables, who had been waiting in the hall. They led Geoffrey away, his footsteps heavy upon the marble floor. When silence returned, Lydia whispered, "How did you know, Miss Marple? How could you be so certain?" The old lady gave a faint smile, reaching for her knitting once more. "My dear, wickedness always betrays itself. One only needs to watch for the small cracks. The colonel broke many lives with his cruelty, but cruelty leaves marks both upon the victim and upon the one who finally turns against it. All I did was look closely at what he left behind." The fire crackled. Outside, the storm began to ease, though the air still trembled with its memory. Miss Marple set her needles to work again, her voice quiet. "It is a terrible thing to live under tyranny, whether in a household or a nation. But the greatest tragedy of all is that sometimes, when freedom comes, it comes in blood, and there is nothing more sorrowful than that." The house had begun to breathe again. With Geoffrey Penrose led away in the constable's charge, the oppressive air seemed to lift from Penrose Manor. Lydia rose from her chair, her face pale but steady, while Eleanor sobbed quietly into her handkerchief. Inspector Craythorne rubbed his temples, muttering something about paperwork, relief clear in his voice. Miss Marple sat serenely by the fire, her knitting needles clinking together, though no yarn threaded them. She had the air of someone who had finished her work and was now content to let the world settle into place. "Thank heavens it's over," Lydia whispered, staring into the flames. Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "One should never speak too soon, my dear. Life has a way of surprising us, especially at the very end." It was not long after Geoffrey's departure that a constable hurried back into the drawing-room, rain dripping from his cloak. He looked harried, uneasy. "Beg pardon, sir," he said to the inspector, "but there's a problem. Mr. Penrose, he's claiming he didn't do it. Says he confessed under pressure." Craythorne groaned. "They all say that once the cuffs are on." "Yes, sir, but—" The constable swallowed. "He insists there's someone else. Said he was being protected, that he only played a part." Lydia gave a startled cry. Eleanor looked up sharply, fear in her eyes. Miss Marple's needles paused in mid-air. Her expression did not change, but her gaze sharpened. "Did he, indeed?" The constable nodded. "He swore his uncle's death was arranged, that he was pushed into it. Said the true architect was still in this house." The silence that followed was absolute. The fire crackled faintly, a log collapsing inward with a hiss of sparks. Rain pattered against the tall windows. Lydia clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Surely that is nonsense. Geoffrey's trying to save himself, that's all." Eleanor shook her head violently, her face streaked with tears. "No, I knew it. I knew he wasn't clever enough to plan it all. He blundered, he always did. But someone must have been guiding him." Inspector Craythorne frowned, looking between the women. "Are you suggesting an accomplice?" Miss Marple lowered her needles and set them gently in her lap. Not merely an accomplice, Inspector. A mastermind. All eyes turned to her. The evidence always troubled me, she continued quietly. Yes, Geoffrey struck the blow. That much is clear. But the staging, the candle, the glove, the clock, those were not the work of a man in a panic. They were intricate, deliberate distractions, too finely arranged for someone of Geoffrey's rash nature. Craythorne frowned. You mean someone else staged the room? Precisely. Eleanor's breath caught. But who? Miss Marple's gaze slid very slowly to Lydia. The room seemed to grow colder. Lydia's hands clenched. Miss Marple, you can't possibly mean me. Her voice trembled, but her eyes glittered with a strange light. Miss Marple's tone remained soft, but there was a new firmness to it. Oh, but I do, Mrs. Harcourt. It was you who orchestrated everything. Geoffrey's debts, his weakness, you used them. You whispered in his ear, nudged him toward desperation, assured him his uncle's tyranny could be ended. And when he struck the fatal blow, you set the stage to make it seem his doing alone. That's absurd. Lydia's voice rose, though her cheeks flushed with colour. Why would I? What possible reason? The motive, my dear, Miss Marple interrupted gently. It was never Geoffrey's, it was yours. You despised your uncle by marriage, did you not? He held the estate over you, refused your requests for funds, threatened your position constantly. You stood to lose everything, if he cast you out. But if Geoffrey were removed, well, as his closest relation left standing, who would inherit the greater share? Lydia's lips parted, then pressed into a thin line. You have no proof. Oh, but I do, Miss Marple said, her eyes kind yet unyielding. The wax upon the carpet was not spilled randomly. It was arranged in a careful trail, as though to suggest accident. I noticed when we first gathered a speck of wax upon your cuff. You must have brushed against it while creating the scene, and then there is the matter of the glove. Eleanor gave a little gasp. Yes, Miss Marple continued. Geoffrey wore one glove, but it was you who placed its twin where it might be found. You alone knew where he kept them. Without that detail, suspicion might have been wider. With it, the noose drew tightly round him. Lydia's eyes flashed, and for a moment the mask slipped. There was steel in her voice now. You speak cleverly, Miss Marple, but you forget, I am not on trial. Geoffrey confessed. The inspector has him in custody. What can your stories do now? Craythorne shifted uneasily, glancing at Miss Marple. For the first time he seemed uncertain. The old lady folded her hands neatly in her lap. Stories can be very powerful, Mrs. Harcourt, especially when they reveal the truth. You see, Geoffrey's confession only came after much prodding, and already he protests. When a man's panic is exploited, the truth will out. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft, but commanding. I dare say, Mrs. Harcourt, that Geoffrey would not have lifted the poker at all if you had not been whispering in his ear these past weeks. You lit the match. He only struck the flame. Lydia stood abruptly, her chair toppling back. Her face was pale, her eyes fever-bright. He was weak, she cried, pathetic. Uncle Penrose ruined us all, crushed us under his heel. Geoffrey was too much a coward to act alone. I merely showed him the way. Do you know what it is like, Miss Marple? To live in that house with a tyrant watching your every move. I saved us, all of us, from him. Eleanor recoiled, trembling. Saved us? You've destroyed us? Inspector Craythorne stepped forward, his voice firm. That will do, madam. But Lydia's voice only grew louder, filled with something between defiance and madness. And what would you know of it, Inspector? You did nothing, none of you did. It was left to me, as it always was. I arranged it all, I made it possible. Geoffrey was too weak to keep silent, so yes, I guided him, I used him, but the victory was mine. The confession hung heavy in the air, raw and undeniable. Miss Marple's face was filled with quiet sorrow. And there, my dear, is the final tragedy. You thought yourself free, but in truth, you bound yourself more tightly than ever. Murder does not liberate, it only enslaves. The constables returned swiftly, this time not for Geoffrey but for Lydia. She did not resist, her fire burned out, only a hollow emptiness left in her eyes. Eleanor wept openly as she was led away, her sobs echoing down the hall. Craythorne muttered something about never trusting a quiet lady again. Though the words rang hollow, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft clink of needles the only sound in the room. At last, she said, almost to herself, "It is always those who seem most composed who are most dangerous. One should never forget that the calmest seas may hide the deepest storms." Outside, the rain eased, a thin sliver of moonlight breaking through the clouds. Yet within the manor, shadows lingered still. The rain had ceased, leaving the world outside Penrose Manor glistening under a timid afternoon sun. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and damp stone, and the manicured gardens reflected each shaft of light like tiny mirrors. Yet within the manor, a chill lingered, a memory of violence, betrayal, and deception that no sunlight could erase. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, knitting still in hand, though her thoughts were far from idle. Inspector Craythorne paced nearby, muttering about paperwork and formalities, but the constables had gone to secure Lydia Harcourt and ensure Geoffrey Penrose was safely detained. The household, once tense and fractured, now lingered in a brittle silence, waiting for some sense of closure. Yet Miss Marple knew that closure, in its truest form, was rarely neat. She began recounting the sequence of hidden details that had led to the final revelation. Her voice was calm, measured, yet carried the weight of certainty. The first clue, she said, was so trivial that no one noticed it. The glove on the console, and its twin half hidden by the chair leg. That indicated a staged struggle, but more importantly, it marked the hand that was guided, the hand of Geoffrey, manipulated, nudged, encouraged. Alone, the glove might have meant nothing. Together, it was the first thread in the web. Inspector Craythorne frowned. Manipulated? You mean someone else orchestrated the whole thing? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and this was reinforced by the candle wax beneath the rug. Freshly melted, placed there deliberately, it suggested accident. Only someone who knew the household and its movements intimately could have arranged such details without being observed. Eleanor and Lydia sat close together, still pallid from the recent revelations, while Geoffrey slouched in the corner, his face drained of defiance. The clock, too, Miss Marple continued. Geoffrey claimed it had been broken for days, but its chime, remembered clearly, told me the timeline could not be trusted. And when combined with the glove and wax, it became clear someone had meticulously crafted a series of distractions to hide the true mover behind the crime. Craythorne's jaw tightened. And that someone was Lydia? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. She understood her uncle's tyranny, his cruelty, and his obsession with control. She knew Geoffrey's weakness and used it. Her motive was not mere greed or revenge. It was survival, and the desperate desire to reclaim agency over a household where she felt trapped. And yet, in orchestrating the murder, she ensured she could profit from it indirectly, even if she never struck the blow herself. Eleanor shivered, her hands trembling as she pressed them into her lap. So she planned it all, and Geoffrey only carried it out. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, and in doing so she created a situation where suspicion would naturally fall upon him, allowing her to remain hidden, calm, and ostensibly innocent, until the smallest details, overlooked, revealed the truth. She tapped her knitting, needles lightly. The scratches on Geoffrey's cuff, the careful placement of the gloves, the trail of wax. Each minor clue was part of the pattern. Only by observing what others deemed trivial could the sequence be unraveled. That is why the eyes of a careful observer, one who notices even the smallest inconsistencies, are invaluable. Craythorne exhaled sharply. Remarkable, Miss Marple, truly. But what of justice? Justice, she said, settling back in her chair, has been served in part. Geoffrey will face trial, as will Lydia. Their complicity is undeniable now, and the law will hold them accountable. Yet one cannot ignore the shades of morality in this tale. Both acted under duress, under fear, under the heavy hand of tyranny. One cannot excuse their crimes, but one can understand the motives that drove them. Eleanor's voice, barely audible, broke the silence. And the others, the household, will they ever feel safe again? Miss Marple looked toward the windows, where sunlight gleamed on the rain-soaked paths. Safety is a fragile thing, my dear, but understanding the pattern, understanding the human heart, can provide solace. They will know at last that the danger has been identified and accounted for. But the scars remain. The inspector paced again, shaking his head. And yet it feels unfinished. It feels as though the house itself holds secrets still. Miss Marple smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. Inspector, there is always a sense of unfinished business in any crime. For even when the guilty are punished, the ripple effects touch many lives. Emotions, trust, and relationships are rarely fully restored. That is the nature of human affairs. She paused, letting the words sink in. And the true genius in this case was noticing the ordinary, the gloves, the wax, the clock. Most investigators focus on grand gestures, but the real truth often hides in the smallest, most mundane of details. Craythorne nodded slowly, conceding. Indeed, Miss Marple, I have learned that lesson well tonight. A silence fell over the room, punctuated only by the soft clink of Miss Marple's knitting needles. Outside, the sun broke fully through, the clouds glimmering on the leaves and wet stone, as if the world itself were attempting to heal. Yet inside Penrose Manor, the memory of betrayal lingered. Geoffrey and Lydia's actions had left a permanent mark, not just on the house, but on every person who had witnessed the unraveling of carefully constructed lies. Trust had been shattered, illusions destroyed, and the quiet of the manor was tinged with unease. Miss Marple, sitting serenely, reflected on the nature of the crimes. Human hearts were complex, unpredictable. Greed, fear, pride, and desperation could combine in ways that led even ordinary people to extraordinary acts. And the detectives' work, as ever, was to see through the smoke and mirrors, to spot the subtle signs, the faintest inconsistencies, the patterns invisible to the untrained eye. She gathered her knitting and rose slowly. Justice has been served in law and in clarity, she said, but life is rarely as tidy as one wishes. Some lessons linger in the shadows, and some consequences cannot be reversed. The household exhaled, collectively and uneasily. Life would continue, though the house itself would never again feel quite ordinary. Miss Marple glanced out the window one last time, watching sunlight glimmer on the wet gardens. The storm had passed, but its memory remained, a reminder that truth, no matter how well hidden, eventually emerges. And the detective, as always, had been one step ahead. The manor lay quiet once more, its grand rooms emptied of urgency and accusation. Rain-soaked footprints had been washed from the marble floors, chairs had been replaced, and the faint tang of wax and candle smoke had faded with the passing hours. Geoffrey Penrose and Lydia Harcourt were gone, escorted by the constables to face their respective fates. Justice, in the narrow sense, had been delivered. Yet the air remained heavy, as though the house itself retained the memory of betrayal, manipulation, and desperation. Miss Marple stood near the wide drawing-room window, hands folded over her knitting. Outside, the gardens glistened, each leaf and blade of grass weighed down by the remnants of the storm. The sun was breaking through now, glinting on puddles and wet stone, but the light did not reach every shadow. Some corners remained impenetrable, darkened by questions that had yet to be fully answered. Inspector Craythorne, pacing impatiently near the fireplace, cleared his throat. I still cannot fathom how you pieced it together, Miss Marple. The evidence, the motives, the way you anticipated every move, it was uncanny. Miss Marple tilted her head in her gentle, unassuming manner. It is never just about what is done, Inspector. It is about what is left undone, what is overlooked, and what people believe is too insignificant to notice. Every detail, however trivial it may appear, can tell a story if one knows how to listen. He exhaled, shaking his head. And yet, despite your brilliance, I cannot shake the feeling that there is more to this case. Something still eludes us. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes scanning the room, resting briefly on the empty space where the colonel had fallen. Perhaps, Inspector, perhaps there is. Her gaze then settled on a corner of the drawing-room where a small table had been overlooked throughout the investigation. At first glance it seemed unremarkable, a place for pens, scraps of paper, and a forgotten candlestick. Yet something subtle caught her eye. A single envelope, slightly crumpled, half hidden beneath the edge of a blotter. She bent to examine it. The The seal was unbroken, faintly marked with a blue insignia. The wax was cold, untouched since the moment it had been affixed. Whoever had placed it there had been meticulous, careful to conceal it from all but the most observant. Miss Marple's lips curved in a knowing smile. "Ah," she murmured, "even in a case so neatly resolved, the smallest details can carry whispers of secrets yet untold." Inspector Craythorne noticed her focus and frowned. "Another clue? Another piece of evidence?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, holding up the envelope. "Or perhaps a message left deliberately to be found only by someone patient enough to notice. One can never be certain. Some mysteries are meant to linger, even when the main thread appears concluded." She turned the envelope over carefully. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, almost ceremonial in its form. No one in the household would have written this, and yet the wax seal bore a crest she faintly recognized from years of quiet observation in other seemingly unrelated cases. It hinted at connections stretching beyond the manor, reaching into the wider world where human motives and schemes often overlapped. Craythorne's brow furrowed. "Do you intend to open it?" Miss Marple held it lightly, her expression thoughtful. "Not yet. Some things reveal themselves in time. To rush a revelation is to risk missing the subtlety. Besides, the presence of this envelope is telling. In itself, someone, perhaps a friend, perhaps an adversary, is ensuring that we understand the case is not entirely closed." The household staff moved quietly about, straightening curtains, wiping surfaces, and tending to the aftermath of a week that had felt endless. They had been witnesses to drama, fear, and revelation, yet they too sensed the unease. The manor had survived storms before, both literal and figurative, but the memory of manipulation and carefully orchestrated deceit would linger in every corridor and hall. Eleanor approached Miss Marple, her expression tentative. "Do you think it is truly over?" The old lady gave a soft, gentle nod. "The immediate danger has passed, my dear. Those responsible have been apprehended, and the truth has been revealed. But the world is rarely as tidy as we might wish. One may solve a crime, yet another may be brewing somewhere, just beyond the veil of perception." Eleanor shivered, half in fear, half in awe. "And the envelope?" Miss Marple set it aside gently on the table. "It is a reminder, a whisper. Even when one believes the story is finished, threads remain. Some questions are not answered fully, and some truths are meant to be uncovered only when the time is right." She moved toward the door, her silhouette framed by the sunlight streaming through the window. Inspector Craythorne followed, eager for any final word of clarity. "Miss Marple," he said, "do you ever tire of these mysteries, the unending complications, the secrets hiding in plain sight?" She paused, looking over her shoulder with a faint, wistful smile. "No, Inspector. That is what keeps the mind alert, the heart compassionate and the eyes sharp. Every case teaches something new, not just about human nature, but about patience, observation, and the courage it takes to see clearly when everyone else is blinded by their assumptions." He nodded slowly, understanding at last the subtle wisdom in her words. As she walked down the corridor, leaving the household to their uneasy peace, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of curiosity prick at her mind. Something in the blue envelope, a shadow of a message, hinted that the story was not entirely complete. Perhaps it would be weeks, perhaps months, before the next clue revealed itself. Perhaps it was merely a test or a warning. Yet she did not hurry. Some mysteries, she reflected, were meant to be savored, examined slowly. Some puzzles left the mind tingling with questions rather than answers. She paused at the grand staircase, looking down at the sunlit hall below. A single candle, forgotten in a corner, flickered faintly in the breeze from the open window. It cast shadows that danced across the walls, subtle distortions of reality, a reminder that clarity often came only after careful scrutiny. Miss Marple took a deep breath, feeling the cool, crisp air of the newly washed world. She knew she had solved the crimes at Penrose Manor, yet she also knew that life, in all its complexity, never truly ends in neat resolutions. A minor detail remained unexamined, a subtle clue unseen by anyone but her. Somewhere she thought a question lingered, a riddle not yet fully revealed, And that, as always, was the true delight of her work, the knowledge that mysteries never entirely fade, that there is always one more secret waiting just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. And with that, Miss Marple stepped into the hall, her mind alert, her senses keen, and her curiosity awakened. The Blue Room murder secret had been resolved, yes, but the world of hidden truths, human folly, and carefully concealed motives stretched far beyond the walls of Penrose Manor. Some mysteries ended only to give birth to new ones, and she, as always, would be ready. The manor fell silent once more, bathed in sunlight and shadows, as a single thread of unanswered questions lingered in the air, a quiet invitation to those patient and perceptive enough to notice it.